Hi and welcome to Train Signal. We're continuing a discussion in our Windows Server 2012 Advanced Services course on RMS, Rights Management Services. RMS is an exciting technology to help secure content that travels around our network to ensure that we know exactly who's consuming it, how they're consuming it, what they can do with that information. It gives us a nice strategy to be able to make sure that our data is being used wisely and well. And what we've seen is that the central component of an RMS instance is something called a cluster, a collection of servers that work together as a group to deliver content to a specific set of individuals. Our goal in this section is to focus on what happens in a case where I've got two or more clusters and I want to be able to knit them together in a way that lets users from one cluster consume content from another. And Microsoft gives us a variety of ways of going about that. So let's jump into the first couple of very commonly used ones. Our first technique for cross-cluster configuration is called trusted user domains. And it's used in a scenario where I've got multiple RMS clusters. Maybe there's one in each of two different domains in the same organization. But a user who got his or her certificates from one RMS cluster wants to be able to access a document that comes from a totally different cluster. Is there a way to do that? Well, actually, there's a couple of ways of going about that basic strategy. But the primary one is this one called trusted user domains. And you can see the scenario here. I've got a client computer. It has a document that it received from somebody. But that document was encrypted using resources in RMS Cluster 1. It was the server licensor certificate for RMS Cluster 1 that was used to encrypt that content. The client computer is part of RMS Cluster 2 and therefore doesn't ordinarily have access to RMS Cluster 1's SLC. If that client called his home cluster, Cluster 2, said, "Hi, I've got this document, I want to get into it." That server looks at that document and says, "I have no idea what to do with that. I can't unpack that. My private key doesn't unlock that information." Fortunately, the client is never going to call RMS Cluster 2 about this because it knows by looking at the package of data in the publishing license that that content was secured by RMS Cluster 1. So the client goes and calls RMS Cluster 1 and says, "Hi, I want to be able to get this document unencrypted. Can I do that?" And under ordinary circumstances, that RMS cluster says, "Sure, yeah, just send me a copy of the private key portion of your client licensor certificate." And the client computer supplies that, and the server looks at that and says, "Ooh, I don't recognize that as being part of any rights account certificate that I issued. You must be from outside of my organization. How do I know I can trust you?" So what's necessary is to inform RMS Cluster 1 of the existence of RMS Cluster 2 and be able to describe that its users, or specifically those users that have been given a rights account certificate in Cluster 2, are acceptable to RMS Cluster 1. The mechanism for that is pretty straightforward. On Cluster 2, the cluster that has the users who want RMS Cluster 1 access, we're going to export something called a trusted user domains file. We're going to take that file, we're going to walk it down the hall on a USB stick, or we're going to email it over to the administrator of RMS Cluster 1, who's going to take that trusted user domain file and import it into RMS Cluster 1. Suddenly, Cluster 2 is a trusted user domain from RMS Cluster 1's perspective. And next time a client from Cluster 2 calls RMS Cluster 1 and says, "Hey, I've got this document, can you let me into it?" Cluster 1 can say, "Ah, yes, I recognize you. You're a Cluster 2 user. That'll be fine, here you go. Here's your key with which to unlock that content." Now, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about with server licensor certificates, client licensor certificates, you'll want to go back and review the lesson on the architecture of ADRMS. We cover the roles of all those various certificates and how they interact with each other there. I'm going to be assuming that you've got that basic knowledge as we work our way through these next couple of ideas. So let me show you the Trusted User Domains GUI. So here on my RMS server, these Trusted User Domain policies live here under Trust Policies. We'll see our two main kinds of communication techniques here: Trusted User Domains, Trusted Publishing Domains. Those come up in just a moment. Under Trusted User Domains, we see an ability to import a trusted user domain. We've got information about our own environment in this object here, which when selected enables my option to export information about my organization. In the example we were looking at, we were reading in an exported TUD file from another organization. RMS Cluster 2's administrator would go to this interface, would go select the Export Trusted User Domain link, and build a binary file, rmscluster2.bin, for example, and put it somewhere that'll be easy to find later. that file, if I right-click that RMS cluster.bin file and try to open it, maybe with Notepad, I see a whole bunch of gibberish. But an RMS server looks at that and sees information that tells it how to be able to contact that other RMS server and interrogate it for a list of user accounts. So that's the export side of the process. Importing is simply the import trusted user domain link. In which case I identify the file that I want to import and the display name of it. What visual indication am I going to use to be able to describe that location? That's going to be RMS cluster 2 here in my example. Now it's telling me that I've already imported that. It's smart enough to know that I don't actually have two RMS instances here. I'm simulating it using the same RMS in both directions. But real world, that would have worked, and I would have imported my trusted user domain document. Now let's look at a different scenario for creating interoperation between two different RMS environments. So our second interoperation scenario is called trusted publishing domains. In a TPD scenario, I've got a local client who calls his local RMS server and says, hey, I've got this RMS document that I got from cluster 2. It was signed by cluster 2, but I want to get into it anyway. Hey, RMS cluster 1, can you help me with it? Ordinarily, RMS cluster 1 would say, no, I don't have an appropriate server license or certificate to unpack the information about that document that was put there using the public key of RMS cluster 2. I would need RMS cluster 2's private key to be able to do that. But when we use a TPD configuration, we do exactly that. We actually put a copy of the server license or certificate, the SLC, from cluster 2 on cluster 1. That means when the client presents a request for a use license and says, hey, I've got this document, can you help me get into it? Cluster 1 says, sure, I can do that. I've got that ability. I've got the private key with which to unpack that publishing license, validate that you are a valid user, validate that the permissions that you're trying to execute are granted there, and can assemble all that information in a way that lets us pass that back down to the client. So let's look at that in the GUI. Trusted publishing domains are perhaps unsurprisingly in this area over here. If I right-click Trusted Publishing Domains, I can import one if I've gotten one from some other environment, and I can supply information about my own and export a trusted publishing domain. Now note something interesting. I'm going to come back to this wizard in just a moment, but first I want you to see that the trusted publishing domain information is my SLC. If you were part of my deploying ADRMS lesson at some point in the past, you may recognize the name of that certificate. That's the same certificate that I used when I created the ADRMS server. That is the SLC. That's the master key with which to lock down everything else in the ADRMS environment. This is the one key to rule them all, if you will. So for demonstration purposes, let me export this trusted publishing domain data. This is what I would do if I want RMS cluster 2 to be able to issue use licenses based on the documents that this cluster provides. We need a name for that file, my RMS cluster by way of example. I'll put that on my desktop. And we do need to specify a password here. Why? What's in there? What's in there is a private key. This document contains the most sensitive piece of information in my whole ADRMS installation. So yes, of course, we're going to password protect it. One additional option here, I can identify if I'm publishing this to RMS version 1. Back before ADRMS was ADRMS, it was just called RMS, and it was a standalone product that I could download and install onto Windows Server 2003 servers. If I want to export a trusted publishing domain and import it into one of those environments, I need to choose to use a version appropriate to that particular release. In this case, I'm going to go from 2012 to 2012, so I'm going to leave that off and click Finish. And you can see in the background here that file just dropped onto my desktop. The import process is just the reverse of that. If this file was not one that I just used to describe this environment, but one that I got from RMS Cluster 2 way over there, I could go import it and import the trusted publishing domain, specifying which file I want to import and supplying the password that goes with it. If I type the wrong password, it's going to say, hey, wait a minute, that's not the right password. Who are you that's trying to get into the private key of that other cluster? I want to supply the correct password, of course. And once again, it's going to complain at me that says, hey, wait a minute, I already recognize that. That's mine. Yes, that's exactly right. But real world, we would see a new entry appear in our list that describes the cluster whose certificate we just imported from that file. There are two other scenarios by which I might extend my AD RMS environment to be able to play nicely with other RMS clusters in my organization. Let's take a moment to look at both of those scenarios before we bring this lesson to a close. This scenario enables the use of something called ADFS. ADFS is a technology that lets me log in using Kerberos authentication in my organization, in my domain, but be able to access resources, web-based resources, using something called Web Single Sign-On, Web SSO, in some partner organization. So in that case, I'm kind of extending access to Active Directory across that connection. And through an elaborate process, which we'll talk about in the ADFS lessons, a client can be granted permissions to do certain things as if they were members of my Active Directory organization. And yet a fourth strategy enables that same kind of ADFS functionality, except it does so by way of something called the Microsoft Federation Gateway. Microsoft makes available a series of servers out there in the web that you can connect through to be able to create a connection bridge between two companies, where rather than deploying your own ADFS environment and setting up connectivity directly to each other, we use Microsoft as the go-between and link our organizations together that way. And then once again, it's almost as if we've extended our Active Directory environment's reach into your organization, so some of your users can authenticate themselves against my environment through that federation link. These ideas will get explored in some more detail in our Active Directory Federation Services lessons elsewhere in this course. But that brings this lesson to a close, so I'll talk to you in another lesson.